In this video, we'll talk about Windows Server 2025's hardware requirements. If your computer doesn't meet the hardware requirements, you still might be able to install Windows Server, though whether you'd want to run a production workload on a computer that isn't up to scratch is a decision only you can make. Let's start with the CPU requirements. And the one you're most likely to be interested in is, does Windows Server 25 require a TPM2 to install in the way that Windows 11 does? The answer to that is no. You can install Windows Server 25 on hardware or in a virtual environment without a TPM2 present. There is a whole lot of Windows Server functionality you can't light up without a TPM chip, but lack of a chip is not the blocker it is with Windows 11 deployment. The minimum requirements are 1.4 GHz 64-bit processor, compatible with x64 instruction set, support for NX and DEP, support for second-level address translation, EPT or NPT, support for the streaming SIMD extensions 4.2 instruction set, support for the POP-CNT instruction, support for CMPEX AG 16B LAHF/SAHF and prefetch W instructions. In theory, you should be fine with anything from Intel after-the-core i7-920 released in late 2008 and AMD chips released after the FX8150 from 2011. I don't recommend you run critical workloads on CPUs that are old enough to be in high school, but what you do in the privacy of your own server room is your business. For full security capabilities, the system needs to have UEFI 2.3.1 C-based system and firmware that supports secure boot and a trusted platform module. This can either be directly or through Hyper-V and other supported virtualization platforms. Hardware-based TPMs must implement version 2.0 of the TPM specification. TPMs that implement version 2.0 must have an EK certificate that is either pre-provisioned to the TPM by the hardware vendor or be capable of being retrieved by the device during the first boot. TPMs that implement version 2.0 must ship with SHA-256 PCR banks and implement PCRs 0 through 23 for SHA-256. It is acceptable to ship TPMs with a single switchable PCR bank that can be used for both SHA-1 and SHA-256 measurements. The minimum RAM requirements are 512 MB for server core and 2 GB for server with desktop experience, 4 GB recommended. Attempting to install Windows Server in a virtual machine configured with the minimum supported hardware parameters, which is 1 processor core and 512 MB RAM, will result in a failed installation. When installing a VM, allocate more than 800 MB RAM, and once setup is complete, reduce the RAM allocation to 512 MB. A VM allocated dynamic memory may use less memory than this at times, but you may want to ensure that 512 MB is configured as a minimum in dynamic memory scenarios. Windows Server requires a minimum of 32 GB of disk space on the operating system volume if installing Server Core. Server with desktop requires an additional 4 GB of disk space. Computers with more than 16 GB RAM require more space on the system volume for paging and dump files. Windows Server should have a network adapter that supports throughput of at least 1 gigabit per second. And that's the minimum hardware requirements of Windows Server 25. I've put links to the documentation on learn.microsoft.com below. If you want to hear more about Windows Server 25 roles, features, technologies, and techniques, click on the playlist on the screen.